It has, to be blunt, been too hard to build stuff in Britain over the past 14 years. A big reason for that is because Tory MPs have whinged about anything being built in their constituency.
Chris, can you talk to me about the Labour Group for Growth? What is it?
So yeah, we've created this new backbench group of Labour MPs called the Labour Growth Group. And the main point of the group really is to diagnose the problem and to try and find ways that we can solve it. So diagnosing the problem is pretty easy, and that's that we haven't had very much, if any, economic growth over the last 14 years in Britain. And the consequences of that have been pretty severe. It means that most households in our country are no richer than they were 14 years ago. If we'd have grown as quick as the OECD average, there'd be £5,000 more going into the pay packets of most families in the country. And of course, if there was £5,000 more going into their pay packets, there'd also be more money going into the Treasury as well. And that would mean billions of pounds more for our NHS and our public services. So we just haven't been able to get that economic growth in the country. We can't have another 14 years like the 14 years we've had. So the most important mission of this government is to bring that growth back. And as a backbench group of Labour MPs, we want to do our bit to help and support the government in achieving that. So unlike what we saw under the last lot, where the most powerful backbench group of MPs was the European Research Group, who were trying to create the most chaotic, badly thought through version of Brexit, we want the most powerful group of backbench MPs in this Parliament to be people who are trying to get economic growth back into our country.
And the big focus is on housing. You want the manifesto commitment to 1.5 million new homes built, is that right? Yeah,
or planning reform generally, and that's a big part of the housing dilemma. But planning reform generally is a big piece that will allow us to create that economic growth. It has, to be blunt, been too hard to build stuff in Britain over the past 14 years. A big reason for that is because Tory MPs have whinged about anything being built in their constituency and been barriers to that kind of construction. So yes, that's the new houses. And that matters to me because I'm from that generation that has been really screwed by the housing crisis. Never been able to buy a house myself. But it's also the other infrastructure projects we need. We don't have the pylons running across the country to carry electricity, and that's one of the reasons why we were so reliant on foreign oil and gas and everyone saw their bills go through the roof. It's too hard to build data centres. When James Cameron wants to build a bloody film studio in the southeast of England, it is too difficult to build those new film studios. And that's a big part of the reason why we've been struggling to grow the economy. So changing that planning reform to make it easier to build stuff is a big part of the work that we need to do.
And Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner actually overrode that decision, didn't she, in Buckinghamshire just last week? The local council has said we're not going to allow the planning permission for this film studio, and she overrode it.
I think she's called it into the department. The department is now looking at it and seeing if going to come to another decision on it. But from my perspective, I think that's a good illustration of the problem. But there's just too many projects like that across the country, and we just need to get back into the culture of, if we want our economy to be growing again, if we want more money to be going into people's pockets, if we want to have the money to make sure that we've got an NHS that still exists in 14 years' time, we've got to make it easier to build stuff in Britain.
But what you're having to tally that with is constituents who probably don't want things built in their backyard. So if you're looking ahead to local elections, are you concerned that if you start building, then you could lose councils?
We're going to have to make sure that we have conversations with our constituents about this, and we've also got to make sure that the projects are right. We've got to make sure that the community sees the benefits from them, and too often that hasn't been happening in the past as well. But to be blunt, there are going to be some people that are going to be upset about it. But actually, I was a pollster for many years before I did this job. And the thing is, actually, most people in the country agree with almost everything that I've just said there. The problem is there's a very small minority of people who are very loud. They're far more likely to be filling up mine and many other MPs' inboxes. They're much more likely to be getting involved in planning consultations. I think 4 or 5 times more likely to write or get involved in a planning consultation if you oppose a project than if you support a project. But they're not representative of wider public opinion. So actually, most people are far more on our side and realise the importance of building the stuff that this country needs. And when it comes to elections more generally, the most important variable from political science in terms of whether I or anyone else in this place is going to get re-elected is whether we're making people richer, whether they feel like there's more money going into their pockets. So if we have to do some things like build some stuff that upset people along the way, they're much more likely to reward us than dodging those hard decisions and the country people in this country being much poorer as a consequence.
Now, if you're going to build over 1 million homes, you're also going to have to build public infrastructure. So what conversations have you had with the Treasury and the upcoming budget about providing, say, new roads, new doctor surgeries, that sort of thing?
So in the Labour Growth Group, we have written this letter to the Chancellor at the weekend, and we have been asking to make sure that we are putting that money into the infrastructure spending. One of the more specific worries I think many of us have is that the current way of measuring debt within the fiscal rules, quite specific, actually actively discourages investing in things where we know we're going to get a return, right? It's silly to, we talk about the importance of growth. It's silly not to be investing in things which are going to pay for themselves many, many times over. So we should be willing to make those kind of investments. The current way we measure debt in the fiscal rules actively discourages that. We think we should tweak the way we measure debt in the fiscal rules in order to be encouraging those investments that we know are needed in order to unlock the houses and unlock the growth that this country needs.
Are you concerned that that could spook the markets?
I don't think there's much risk of spooking the markets at all, to be honest, because the markets appreciate growth. The metric that you might want to change to is far closer to what investors would be considering when deciding whether they should be investing in a business. Most of them would think it's a bit weird that we're measuring debt in the way that we do, because when you're making investment decisions, you've got to look at both sides of the balance sheet, and at the moment our measure isn't. And look, the thing that the reason we've seen markets panic before is because they don't think there is a plan for growth, right? They're perfectly willing to see investments happen if they think that there's going to be a return on them. But when you saw, chaos beforehand, it's because they were doing that, but with no plan for growth. What we need, the most important thing to remain the confidence of the markets, is to make it clear, yes, we're going to have proper fiscal rules in place, and we should continue to have those, but also that we've got a plan to get our economy growing again.
We heard yesterday that Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, is planning to raise capital gains tax to 25%. Is that around the figure that the Labour Growth Group would have wanted?
Well, we're not taking necessarily any specific positions on taxes and spending, and so you're going to get the boring answer.
Aren't you? Because you've got, if you want public investment, you've got to raise capital somewhere. So coming through capital gains. Yeah. Well,
I think the important point is there are things that we can do to make sure that the fiscal rules are actively encouraging investment in growth, not discouraging it, and that's the policy area we're particularly focusing on. I'm not an expert in tax policy, so I don't want to necessarily go into the specifics of it, other than to say those projects that we're talking about that you can change with the fiscal rules, they're about the long-term investment. That's the capital projects. That still doesn't get you around your day-to-day spending problems. You're paying your wages, you're keeping the lights on in your public buildings, those day-to-day problems that this country, even if we do make these changes that we're asking for, they're still going to be massive. The £22 billion black hole left by the Tories doesn't disappear just because we decide to make those smart long-term investments. So we're still going to have to.
It does if you tweak the fiscal rules, though, like you're advocating.
Well, but that's on the debt rule. So that frees us up for capital spending, investing in infrastructure projects. That doesn't solve our day-to-day problem that the Tories left. So we are still going to have to make some really difficult short-term decisions on spending and on taxes in order to get us through this difficult period until we can start to see the payoff and get that growth back into our economy.
Do you think that constituents want to have or want to see tough decisions being made at the moment, or do you think they're ready for spend? No,
I don't think. What is most depressing at the moment is that we have come to power in a place where our public services are completely broken, where our public finances are in a complete mess. We've got public, far worse than we've seen any other government in recent time have to face. But actually what's more depressing than both of those things is we rightly have a country that's run out of patience. We have had to ask so much of people in this country over the last 14 years, from lockdowns and the pandemic to the ridiculous decisions that were Tories forced on this country for austerity, right? Awful decisions. And it's pretty difficult to have to come to power and to ask people to have to engage in a few more difficult decisions. So I do get why people sort of do feel like they've had a lot asked for them and are running out of patience for that. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's really important that we make sure that we focus so hard on creating this economic growth, because it's only by doing that that we can ensure that this country has a much brighter, much better future, where there's more money in people's pockets, and governments in the future are having to make fewer, tougher decisions than unfortunately we're having to make today.
Have you heard from any constituents about your planning reforms?
I mean, I've heard from constituents on a wide range of problems. But look, I mean, I spoke to 10, 15, 20,000 people during the election campaign along with my team, and you hear from a wide range of people. But the stories that really stick with me from the election campaign is the mum who's stuck in private rental accommodation with her 2 kids, being booted out of her house again because the landlord's kicking her out for whatever reason, and she doesn't know what school her kids are going to go to in September and how she's going to get them there, right? It's the guy who's living into his late 30s, still not managing to get onto the housing ladder, still having to live with mum and dad because we have failed to build the number of houses in this country. And it's those stories and those people that stick with me, and making sure that we can give them and their kids the great start in life that I had, the brilliant, bright future, and the stability that comes with their own house is really important, and I'm determined to do what I can to make sure I get those houses built.
And Kemi Badenoch, who's the potential new Conservative leader, she's not for the Renters Reform Bill that you've been pushing through. She was pretty upset, actually.
She was in favour of the Renters Reform Bill before, right? I was a pollster before I did this, and the bit I specialised in was polling Conservative Party members. Now, I don't want to speculate on why Kemi has done this slightly bizarre U-turn on the Renters' Rights Bill, from when she was massively supportive of it before to giving this bizarre rant about how much she opposes it now. I don't know why she's done that U-turn, but one reason might be that the 100 or 1,000 or so people who are going to be deciding the next Conservative leader, the Conservative Party membership, they're half as likely to be private renters than the population as a whole, and twice as likely to be landlords. Perhaps that's a reason why she's ended up doing this this U-turn and come out against this really important landmark piece of legislation.